Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and this one is a real train ride with Arthur Hiller's Silver Streak against George Gallo's Double Take. And like I said, this was a real ride of a fucking double feature, because both these movies are really fun, But starting off, we have Arthur Hiller's Silver Streak with a very brilliant script by Colin Higgins, and of course, the brilliant comedy duo of Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. And of course, the film also boasts a bevy of other stars like Jill Clayburgh is in it, Ned Beatty, Patrick McGoohan, and a few other Fred Willard pops up in this motherfucker, and of course Richard Kiel, who is most notable for playing Jaws in The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. But the film basically centers around like Gene Wilder, like he's a writer, he's on a train to go, kind of escape from shit, relax and all this shit, and in a very kind of Hitchcockian twist, ends up in all this fucking web of like deceit and like the FBI is involved, and it's all something to do with some fucking fake art, Rembrandt shit, and all it stems from is just homeboy getting a piece of ass, because he hooks up with Jill Clayburgh and then ends up seeing her boss dangling dead from the window, but nobody really believes him at first, and then he gets pushed around by these thugs, one of them played by Ray Walston, the other one fucking Jaws that throws him out of the train, and just the comedic timing of Gene Wilder is fucking brilliant, and also too Arthur Hiller knows how to make a fucking movie. Like there's a perfect balance of action, comedy, thriller. It's the kind of film like kind of like a North by Northwest type fucking thing. Gene Wilder may not be as like suave as Cary Grant, but he definitely can get in the same situations as Cary Grant. Many times he gets thrown off the train, and how he gets back on the train is pretty fucking, creative. The fucking lady with the plane, that shit's pretty fucking wild. And then once he runs into Richard Pryor, that's when the comedy really steps up into high gear, because, those two playing off of each other was absolutely brilliant. And this one might be the best film that they did together, as far as like, maybe not just by laughs, but it's just a real ass fucking movie, because. And of course, like Patrick McGoohan, he's the main villain in it, and that dude's like, just perfectly sleazy. And like his death scene, this movie does not fuck around, because these motherfuckers, his death scene, really like kind of a shout out to Shadow of a Doubt, but a lot more harsher by even just the shit that you don't see. What is insinuated is shocking as fuck, And fucking Jaws gets taken out by a spear gun. I mean, the movie's pretty fucking intense. It's all over the place as far as like, how many times the motherfucker gets thrown off the train and then back onto it. And then, that scene with Clifton James is that silly ass sheriff, it's just, you ignorant son of a bitch, dumb bastard. It's just so fucking, just like Gene Wilder's great. And that ending, the fucking train just goes right through the fucking station and shit. It's just that whole thing. Scatman Crothers is in this. It is a really great fucking movie, really fun time, just sitting down watching a movie. And also moving forward too, we have Double Take, which stars Orlando Jones and Eddie Griffin in kind of a similar tale of intrigue. Orlando Jones is this kind of, uptight Wall Street businessman and shit. And, his life kind of gets turned upside down when, there's a murder and shit. And he's accused of it, and he runs into this crazy motherfucker played by Eddie Griffin, who, like, may or may not be in the FBI and shit. And, but he's got this, who he thinks is an FBI agent is actually in the fucking pocket of the drug cartels and shit. So, like, there's so many twists and turns in this movie that it gets to the point where you don't really give a fuck about the plot. You just fucking want to see Orlando Jones and Eddie Griffin, interact with each other. Because, Eddie Griffin does some heavy lifting comedic wise. Because whenever Eddie Griffin's on the screen, he just, makes it funny. The motherfucker can command a scene, and, just you may not be laughing at any time in that movie, but when Eddie Griffin's on, you never stop fucking laughing. And, but the film itself, it's kind of got that sleek, fucking comedy thriller type shit that they made in the late 90s, early 2000s and shit. But it definitely fun mainly because of Eddie Griffin. And, and Orlando Jones is great too. And of course, you got the lovely Vivica A. Fox is in this, but the movie is so it gets exhausting to the point where it's like, well, what the fuck is the point, Because it's like, oh, well, then here's this twist, here's this turn, blah, blah, blah. It just gets by the end, then everything, of course, it all is gonna work out, and then fucking you have some silly ass fucking scene tagged on at the end with now they're all hanging out with each other and shit, and so I mean, for as fun as Double Take is, I gotta give it to Silver Streak on this one because Silver Streak not only plays well as a comedy, but it plays well as a regular ass movie action thriller. Plus Arthur Hiller is a lot better of a director than George Gallo. To me, and also that script by Colin Higgins for Silver Streak is great because Double Take just seems to me like a fucking, George Gallo's credited for writing the script for Double Take too, but it just seems like a bunch of shit like, how do we get out of this situation? How do we get out of that situation? Whereas Silver Streak just kind of moves with a flow that's just fucking brilliant. Some of the shit you can see coming a mile away, but it plays like fucking old school Hitchcock and shit. You can imagine like, Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint being the Gene Wilder, Joe Kleber fucking dynamic and shit, and it's like I said, it's real fun, and and the ending's a lot better too. That's one thing about the 90s. They would have like fucking sappy ass fucking endings and shit that just like kind of make you want to throw up in your mouth a little bit. But whereas like the 70s, they'll literally run a fucking train through the station. That fucking sequence is just like they break away just in time, but then the front half of that fucking train still goes through and shit. And and the bad guy, like I said, the movie doesn't fuck around. So this is the tiebreaker. Just when I thought the 90s were going to keep coming with it, the 70s end up breaking the tie. So for anybody keeping score, that's 17-16. 70s are up by 1 now. Definitely heating up. Like I said, both movies here were fun, but also too, nothing can top the fucking comedy duo of Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor at that time. They would go on to do several movies, but I really don't think anything tops Silver Streak. It's just a fucking great movie. Shout out to Arthur Hiller and shit. But 17-16, 70s are up by 1. They're coming back again. It was looking like the 90s was going to overtake them, but maybe the 70s will still hold strong and shit. We got the main event coming up with 3 Days of the Condor versus Spy Game, so that one will be even more of a wild card than this one was. But all I know is it's going to be fun. And like I said, if I've said anything wrong or anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. I'm here for fun. I don't give a fuck. I'm writing a rough draft to my doctoral thesis. And, for all you film professors, film douchebag, anybody that just loves film, holler at me if you got any recommendations, or you want to collaborate. We'll discuss a lot of this because there's a lot of layers to some of these movies and themes and shit that, you want to keep these fucking videos short as possible. I really don't like to exceed 15 minutes and I'll be rambling on about, subtext and all that bullshit, so who knows, whatever the fuck. But all I know is I'll keep throwing these rounds out because, I got to know, there's so many that I have lined up and, it's only heating up. But 17-16, 70s always holding strong.